Parents abandoned me after their divorce. Years later, they're back demanding money. I'm 21 now, but my life turned upside down when I was 12. My parents got divorced when I was 11, and it came completely out of the blue. I thought everything was fine between them. One day, they sat me down together and told me they were splitting up. At first, I thought it was a joke. I had this idea from my friends' stories that divorces came with loud fights and yelling matches that dragged on for years. But my parents, it was more like a silent divorce. They told me they'd both fallen for other people. Mom was moving out with her boyfriend, and Dad's mistress would move into our home. They explained I'd live with them both, shuffling weekly between their houses, since they'd only be a couple of miles apart. I didn't have a say in any of it. All I could do was sit there and cry as my family shattered before my eyes. My parents promised me the world. They said I'd be their top priority and assured me I'd get all the latest video games, vacations, and anything else I wanted. But all I really wanted was to live with them under one roof, as a family. It broke me to see Mom packing her things and moving out while Dad's mistress unloaded her truck and claimed my parents' bedroom as her own. The divorce was amicable, at least for them. Dad's mistress had twin boys who were about my age, and they hated me just as much as I hated them. Mom's boyfriend had a daughter from a previous marriage, but she lived with her mom. I thought I'd spend more time with Mom, but things got awkward quickly. Shortly after moving out, Mom got pregnant with her boyfriend's baby. Her new husband seemed uncomfortable having me around, and their public displays of affection made me feel unwelcome. Dad's house wasn't any better. My stepmom and her sons made it clear I wasn't wanted. Eventually, I started spending more time at my aunt's house. She's my dad's sister and also my godmother. She's about 10 years older than Dad and lived alone, so she didn't mind when I showed up occasionally. After a year of bouncing between 3 houses, I moved in with her permanently. It took my parents 3 months to realize I wasn't living with either of them. Mom thought I was at Dad's and Dad thought I was at Mom's. Neither of them had checked on me. They were too caught up in their new families to notice I existed. My aunt, on the other hand, was a savior. She made me feel loved and cared for. She'd take me out to dinners, movies, and even vacations. Every summer, we'd visit my grandpa at his farm in the countryside. Those were the happiest times of my life. Initially, Dad would send my monthly allowance to my aunt, but even that stopped after a while. Sometimes my aunt would remind him, and other times she'd let it slide. I felt guilty about being a burden, so I started helping out at her plant nursery after school to earn my keep. I also helped with household chores, taking out the trash, running errands, and grocery shopping. Life with her was simple, but it felt like home. Meanwhile, my parents forgot I existed. They even forgot my birthdays. When my aunt reminded them, they'd call me with half-hearted apologies, claiming they loved me so much. I overheard my aunt calling them to inform them when I was sick, but they never showed up, not even on my graduation day. It was my aunt who cheered me on that day, while my parents offered nothing but excuses. Eventually, I grew resentful of their neglect. I stopped answering their calls, and they stopped trying. When they did call, they blamed me, saying I'd grown rude and unresponsive. I decided I didn't care. If they wanted to play the blame game, I wasn't going to participate. I told them I didn't want them in my life anymore. After high school, I went to university and moved out of my aunt's house. I still visit her often for holidays and birthdays because she's become my family. She's attached to me now, just as I am to her. 3 months ago, my grandpa on my dad's side passed away. It was a heartbreaking loss for both me and my aunt. Grandpa was closest to us because Dad and my uncles rarely visited him. Ironically, they all showed up at his funeral and the lawyer's office to hear the reading of his will. Grandpa left everything to my aunt. She inherited his 150-acre farm, the farmhouse, and $1 million in cash. The rest of his money went to charity. It was brutal for Dad and my uncles, but if you knew Grandpa's side of the story, it made sense. Grandpa had been ill for years and begged his sons to visit him. Despite my aunt's repeated requests, none of them came. She moved in with Grandpa during his final days to care for him, while the rest of the family ignored him. After settling Grandpa's estate, my aunt called me home. She told me she wanted me to have the $1 million Grandpa left her. I was speechless. She reminded me of all the times I dreamed aloud about starting my own company, and she said this money was to help me achieve that dream. I hugged her and cried. Without her, my life would have been unbearable. News of the inheritance spread quickly. Suddenly, my parents were showering me with love, calling constantly to check on me. I told them to back off. I didn't want them in my life. Last week, my dad even showed up at my dorm, uninvited. I'm certain he got my address from my aunt, as I doubt he even remembers which university I attend. After a long speech about how proud he was of me for graduating soon, he asked why I hadn't visited his home. I looked him straight in the eye and asked, "When was the last time you even called me?" He stood silent for a moment, then tried to dismiss it. "Oh, you're still mad about the divorce? Come on, move on. We both love you. Your mother misses you too. Let me drive you home, and we can all have dinner together." That was the final straw. "Back off," I told him. "The only family I have is my aunt. You and Mom abandoned me a long time ago, so quit pretending you care. I know why you're here. It's because of the $1 million. That's what brought you back." Dad denied it, claiming he had no ulterior motive and was there purely out of love. He said he was sorry and wanted me back in his life. He mentioned my upcoming graduation and insisted he and Mom wanted to be there since I didn't invite them to my high school graduation. I didn't want to hear any more. I cut him off mid-sentence, telling him I had a class to attend, and left. Later that day, I got a voicemail from Mom. She said she was expecting an invite to my graduation. She rambled about how proud she was of me and how she and Dad had always dreamed of me going to university because they never got the chance themselves. She claimed it was a huge moment for her and wanted to celebrate it with me. The thing is, I didn't want either of them there on my big day. I told my aunt about the situation, and while she said it was up to me, she suggested I consider reconciling with them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that their sudden interest was more about the money than genuine pride in my accomplishments. Update 1. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the late update. Life has been busy. The good news? I graduated from university and landed a job. Before I dive into the current situation, let me answer some questions about my aunt. She's 10 years older than my dad and has been a widow for as long as I can remember. Her husband passed away in an accident when I was just a baby. She has a daughter who moved out in her teens to attend medical school and is now a cardiologist living in the UK. My aunt has lived alone for years and never remarried. She says her plants are all the companionship she needs. Some of you mentioned I was harsh on my parents, and I agree they had every right to separate and remarry. But what isn't justified is abandoning your child once you start a new family. That's exactly what they did. They neglected me while prioritizing their new lives. Initially, the custody agreement had me alternating weeks between Mom's and Dad's houses. But they quickly started treating my presence like a burden. They planned dinners or outings specifically after I left, sometimes even discussing it in front of me. "Oh, Wei is here this week. Let's go out next week," they'd say, as if I weren't sitting right there. Mom's house was unbearable. Within months of moving in with her boyfriend, she got pregnant. Their public displays of affection made me uncomfortable, and one time they took me on a trip only to leave me stuck in the room while they went sunbathing. When they were in the room, they'd make me sit outside on the balcony. I was just 11, but even then, I knew what was happening. After that trip, I stopped visiting Mom altogether. Dad was slightly better, but not by much. He'd try to include me in plans, but his stepsons would throw tantrums, and he'd backtrack, saying, "Maybe next week." That next week never came. On one rare family vacation, his wife and her sons kept him so busy that I felt completely ignored. They even excluded me from family pictures. Out of all the photos from that trip, only one included me, and it was just with Dad. When my parents said they wanted to attend my university graduation, I refused. "Where were you during my high school graduation?" I asked. They persisted, so I relented sort of. I didn't invite them, but kept extra hall tickets just in case they showed up uninvited. They didn't. Turns out, they forgot all about it. The whole graduation thing was just an excuse for them to worm their way back into my life. It's been almost a month since that day, and neither of them has called to ask how it went. Update 2. About 2.5 months after graduation, Mom called me out of the blue. She started off by saying my half-sister had graduated from primary school and was now enrolled in a private elementary school. Then she hit me with it. They were short on funds and wanted me to pitch in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. When I asked why I should fund my half-sister's education, Mom said, "She's your sister. It's your time to step up as a big brother." She wasted no time getting to the real point. "We know your aunt gave you the $1 million inheritance. Your sister needs you now." I stopped her right there. "Excuse me, who's delusional here? I've never even met the sister you're talking about. Where were you when I needed my mom? When I was sick or alone? Nowhere. Don't act like I owe you anything." Mom started sobbing, trying to guilt trip me. "What can I say if you're still stuck in the past? You have so much money now. What better use for it than helping your sister get an education at a private school?" I could have said a lot, but I held back. I have plans for that money, and I'm not sparing a penny for anyone else. She hung up after that and didn't even bother to ask about my graduation day. That confirmed what I already knew. Her sudden love for me was all about the money. I was still processing Mom's call when I got one from a bank. They told me Dad had defaulted on a mortgage and asked if I could pay it. When I asked how they got my number, they said Dad had given it to them. Apparently, he'd taken a personal loan, missed payments, and directed the bank to me when they came looking for him. At first, I panicked. I didn't know how these things worked and feared I might be legally obligated to pay. I called a friend who was in law school, and he assured me I wasn't responsible for Dad's debts. Recovery agents often try to intimidate relatives into paying, but I was within my rights to refuse. When the bank called me again a week later, they used a more aggressive tone, demanding to know when I'd pay up. This time I stood my ground. "Who gave you the right to talk to me like this?" I said. "Did I default on a mortgage?" "No. So don't call me again. Chase the person who owes you money." The agent apologized and hung up, but I knew they'd redirect their frustration toward Dad. Sure enough, a few hours later, Dad's wife called me. She was furious. "What did you say to the recovery officers?" "They stormed in, grabbed your dad by the collar, and threatened to break his bones if he didn't pay." I kept my tone calm. I told them to chase the person who took the loan. "That's it," she yelled. "Don't you have a heart? Your dad is struggling, and you're turning your back on him even though you have so much money." "Yeah, I don't have a heart for him because he didn't have one for me," I replied. "He has a heart for you and your sons. Why don't you all chip in? I'm sure he borrowed that money for you." She hung up in frustration. Later that night, Dad called me drunk and sobbing. He apologized for everything, for prioritizing his stepsons, for not being there for me, and for all the mistakes he'd made. He begged for forgiveness and pleaded with me to let him back into my life. "I've learned to live without you," I told him. "I don't want to talk about the past or have you back in my life." After writing the last update, I felt a pang of guilt. I even considered calling Dad to ask how much he needed. But before I could, I received an email from Mom inviting me to dinner. She said they wanted to make up for missing my graduation day and suggested it be just the three of us, like old times. I wasn't interested in reminiscing about the good old days, but I decided to go. I wanted to see what they were really after and put an end to this saga once and for all. At dinner, they stuck to the same script. Apologies, remorse, and pleas for forgiveness. I nodded and smiled, playing along. Then Mom dropped the pretense. "Baby, we were wondering what plans you have for the money." I looked at her, and she quickly added, "No, I mean your dad and I could give you some good investment advice. You're pretty young to be making these decisions on your own." I casually replied, "Thanks, but Anna's helping me with that." Silence hung in the air. A few minutes later, Mom tried again. "You know your dad is in trouble because of the mortgage he defaulted on." I turned to Dad. "Why did you take out that loan?" He lowered his head. "It was for my son's college." Before I could respond, Mom cut in, "It doesn't matter why. The point is, your dad is in trouble, and we need to help him." Mom's dinner invitation turned into a full-on ambush. After trying to guilt me into clearing Dad's mortgage and funding my half-sister's private school, Mom came up with another brilliant idea. She suggested I cover Dad's debt now, with the promise that his stepsons would repay me once they got jobs. As for my half-sister's education, she claimed she'll pay you back when she's older and starts earning. I had enough. "How about we quietly eat our dinner and call it a day?" I said, keeping my tone casual. Mom lost her temper at my sarcasm. yelling that I was still the attention-seeking brat who only cared about himself. "Yeah, that's exactly who I am," I shot back. I could have lectured them about their behavior, but what would be the point? They knew I had my own education loan to pay off, yet they expected me to give up my money for my stepbrother's loan and my half-sister's private schooling. Meanwhile, I'd be left working hard to pay off my own debts. I stood up, leaving my share of the dinner bill on the table. "I'm done with you guys," I said. "You only came back into my life for money. Guess what? You're not getting a penny. Suck it up."